In the first Trump term, I think he kind of viewed looking at Kim Jong-un as a challenge that the Washington establishment couldn't do until now. The nuclear weapons part, that's basically just the way that North Korea gets the rest of the world to take it seriously. Because if it wasn't for the nukes, I think North Korea would probably be in a very similar conversation with other small Middle Eastern or African countries that are also similarly tin pot despotic dictatorships. But because they have the nukes, that's why they're part of this conversation.
In the first term with President Trump, he was very interested in relations with North Korea and particularly with the North Korean leader. Why, in his second term, has he been very quiet on this issue?
Yeah, well, in the first Trump term, I think he kind of viewed looking at Kim Jong-un as a challenge that the Washington establishment couldn't do until now. So when he met with Obama before his first term, Obama told Trump that North Korea was the most pressing and most difficult foreign policy issue that the United States was facing. So hearing that, I think Trump took that upon himself as like a challenge, as something that he could do that no one else could. And so that's one reason why he aggressively pursued diplomacy with North Korea a few years ago. But now, flash forward all this time later, there's basically very little leadway that the North Koreans and the Americans can have with each other. So, America's demand is the complete denuclearization of North Korea, while North Korea demands sanctions relief. But because North Korea has no interest in denuclearization, the U.S. has no interest in sanctions relief. So they're at this standstill, and there's really no way to move progress forward with the way things currently are.
So when he did meet with Kim Jong-un in, what was it, around 2018 time, what was the significance of that? Has that had any kind of lasting impact, or was that a sort of flash in the pan in terms of diplomacy?
Yeah, I wish I could say that it was something that had lasting impact, but as we've seen for the past few years with the North Koreans of how they've acted, it's really done very little to deter them from pursuing nuclear weapons and expanding their arsenal, and to basically continue threatening South Korea, Japan, and everybody else in the region. It was significant in the fact that Trump was the first sitting U.S. president to meet with the North Koreans, but even before him, former President Jimmy Carter and former President Bill Clinton, after their presidencies, they did go to North Korea to have some kind of diplomacy with them, but that too didn't really have much impact either. So, yeah, it could be a long time before we see another U.S. president meet with the North Koreans, but the reason why it hasn't happened is because there's very little interest in Washington to come back to the negotiating table.
And that's because the North Koreans don't want to dismantle their nuclear program. Is that right? They don't want to make any kind of concessions in that area.
Correct. They view their nuclear weapons as their treasured sword. It was always the lifelong ambition for Kim Jong-un to have North Korea become a full nuclear country. And they've seen what happened with Libya when they denuclearized, what happened to Gaddafi. So from their perspective, they think that there's no reason to get rid of nuclear weapons. And it's not entirely unjustified if you view it from their perspective. We're seeing that also with the Ukraine and Russia war. Ukraine gave up its nukes, and now it's obviously very much threatened by its neighbor. So those are many reasons why North Korea sees no incentive to get rid of its nukes anytime soon or ever.
But North Korea is still relevant on the world stage because of its nuclear weapons, but it's also been aiding the Russians in their war in Ukraine. Can you talk a bit about how North Korea is cooperating with Russia in Ukraine?
Sure. So North Korea and Russia are very similar in the fact they have very few allies on the world stage that are willing to do business with them or conduct any kind of diplomacy, mostly just because there's a lot of sanctions involved and most of the world is on the side of Ukraine. However, North Korea, after coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's in desperate need of economic support, of whatever it can get from its allies, be that Russia, China, Iran, etc. So by sending these 10,000 or so troops, North Korean troops to Ukraine, from Kim Jong-un's perspective, he feels like that he can get a lot of benefits from Vladimir Putin, whether that's extra military support, economic support, anything to help its fledgling economy.
And do you think that this cooperation with Russia is going to heat up during the war? Like, do you think they're going to send more resources and more men? Is this also helpful for the North Korean army to kind of train into train in combat and so on?
Well, I think that the presence of North Korean troops in Ukraine, it's not a game changer, but it helps Vladimir Putin continue basically what's a war of attrition. So as things go on, Putin is basically just putting as many men and much military hardware into the meat grinder. So these 10,000 extra North Korean troops, that just helps them prolong the process and slowly take more territory from the Ukrainians. As is now, if let's say that the U.S. basically stopped all aid to Ukraine and it was just between the Ukrainians and the Russians, unfortunately, probably Russia would win, but that would take a very long time and it would take a lot of manpower from Putin. So from his perspective, it's probably better to sacrifice North Korean lives than it would be to sacrifice Russian lives forever, as long as it may take.
So should North Korea be a priority for the second Trump administration at all, if what you're saying is true?
It would be a good thing if Trump could focus more on North Korea because I guess some diplomacy is better than no diplomacy, obviously. But at the time being, it's very much a secondary or even tertiary issue. Right now, Trump is very busy with the trade war with China, with all the tariffs, trying to find some way to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, have some influence with Hamas in the Middle East. So, all these other huge priorities, there's very little leadway that they can do with North Korea at the time.
So, as you said, Trump is in this kind of trade war with China. He's obviously trying to sort of bring back industry to the United States. Where does North Korea sit in this trade war with China? Where does North Korea sit in Trump's diplomatic kind of war with China?
Well, if we go back to Trump 1.0, he very much wanted China to play a big role in diplomacy with North Korea. There was always this view in Washington for a long time that China could rein North Korea in because North Korea was so dependent on Chinese investment, Chinese economic aid. But as we've seen in the last few years, China has grown much more apart from the U.S. and most of Western international society. At the UN, for example, every time there's any kinds of proposals for new sanctions against North Korea, that's always vetoed by China and Russia. And with the trade war going on between the U.S. and China, there's very little incentive for China to have any kind of cooperation with the U.S. So possibly what could happen in the long term is that Trump could say that perhaps if you help us with North Korea, we'll reduce some tariffs on you. We'll come back to the negotiating table with have better economic terms. But that would be, I think, kind of a Hail Mary or something that would happen much later than now. At the time being, I don't think it's a priority.
In terms of North Korea's ability to produce and to export weapons around the world, can you explain how that works, how efficient they are, how effective they are, where they're sending their armaments to, not just in Ukraine, and how are they able to get around those sanctions by exporting those shipments to Russia?
Correct. So yeah, North Korea is essentially fashioning itself as a global arms exporter, particularly to countries that the U.S. views as threats, such as Iran or Hezbollah or the Russians. And first, they're able to have a huge capacity for production because they do mass mobilizations of their people throughout the year. North Koreans, they are under intense pressure to reach quotas and to produce as much ammunition and military hardware as possible. Well, the work conditions are notoriously terrible. It's essentially slave labor. And yeah, even though this is really bad for the people of North Korea, for the North Korean government themselves, it's just reaching those quotas and having as much production as possible is their main goal. So that's the production aspect. But the exporting aspect, there's various ways that North Korea tries to sidestep sanctions. As I referred to previously, China and Russia are very much less likely to cooperate with the UN and the United States on sanctions enforcement. So they've constantly turned a blind eye in the last few years. There's other places like Uganda and Jordan that have either sympathetic people in the government or very lax sanctions enforcement. So that's been ways that North Korea's been able to produce shell companies or munitions factories in these other parts. There's a very good documentary called The Mole, which goes into detail of how North Korea sidesteps these sanctions. They've also done things like flying ships under different flags. So if they fly underneath the flag of a non-sanctioned country, they can move stuff to other parts of the world. And then, therefore, through a complex chain, it gets to where it needs to go.
Why is North Korea's nuclear arsenal a threat? Because they haven't used it, obviously, yet. And if they were to use it, surely that would just lead to their own destruction. So there's a kind of, mutually assured destruction thing going on there. Why should we be concerned about North Korea?
Well, on its own in a vacuum, North Korea itself, it's a very poor country. If there was a war between North Korea and the U.S. and its allies, I do think that North Korea would eventually lose, but it would still be a very hugely costly war. And you just have to go back to the Korean War. That was a war fought without nuclear weapons, just through conventional warfare. But the terrain of the Korean Peninsula and just the amount of sheer destruction that war caused for millions of people, it was an unfathomable scale that's very hard for people like us to comprehend today. So if a full-scale war was to go out, it would have huge consequences for the entire region, and it wouldn't just be North Korea getting involved, obviously. It would also be China and Russia. The nuclear weapons part, that's basically just the way that North Korea gets the rest of the world to take it seriously. Because if it wasn't for the nukes, I think North Korea would probably be in a very similar conversation with other small Middle Eastern or African countries that are also similarly tin pot despotic dictatorships. But because they have the nukes, that's why they're part of this conversation. But I think the important point that people should realize, though, is that denuclearization of North Korea is not going to happen anytime in the future because Kim Jong-un has obviously said that's not in their interests. So I think the least worst case scenario that we can hope for is measured arms control, where the U.S. and the rest of the world recognizes North Korea as a nuclear state, similar to China or India or Pakistan. But we have North Korea sign these agreements to try to have some degree of arms control. But this is obviously a very long-term conversation that's decades from now, and we have to get to a situation where North Korea is actually at the negotiating table, and there's reasons for them to even engage in arms control. But yeah, those are long-term plans, and that's going to go way beyond the current Trump administration.
What would be your advice to the Trump administration when dealing with North Korea?
I think probably the best move that they can play now is to keep them in like their keep North Korea in its sights and don't let them like get away with like doing really bad things that can harm U.S. interests in the long run. But at the same time, continue playing this wait and see attitude to see like what actions can realistically be taken. So there's always things like new sanctions. There's always more pressure, and as your listeners and your audience will remember, in 2017 things were very bad between the U.S. and North Korea. We really thought they were going to be on the brink of a full-scale war, but cooler heads eventually prevailed and there was negotiations. So if we can at least avoid something like that, I think that's probably the best thing the Trump administration can do for the time being.
And just finally, I know that you're based in Japan. What's going on in Japan at the moment with their relations with the US? I know there's been some difficulties because of the tariffs and so on. And how does that link in with Japan's relationship with China?
Yeah, so Japan is obviously a very important U.S. ally, and it's something that I think also the Trump administration is having a bit of tensions with now because there's having these ongoing negotiations over tariffs and over trade relations, and probably eventually defense spending later on. So I think those are issues that the U.S. and Japan should solve sooner rather than later because obviously for the U.S., Japan is a valuable ally along with South Korea. And these three countries really need to have a strong trilateral partnership to have this strong bulwark against North Korea and the Chinese and the Russians. So yeah, but the biggest issue that Japan faces is that it's constrained by Article 9 of its constitution to have offensive military capabilities. So it has more restrictions in place on its army and its military forces than South Korea does. But Japan has tried its best to move past that by increasing defense spending and really pushing the limits of what the constitutional restrictions are. So yeah, if that's a whole other subject too of like what's Japan's history with warfare, like how would it be able to like hold its own in a fight against North Korea or China. But I think for the time being that within its restrictions, it's been playing a very pragmatic role with these regional dynamics. And it's my personal hope that both Trump and current Prime Minister Shiba will be able to overcome their differences with trade and have a strong defense against North Korea and China and Russia.